So a couple of days ago, I moved my 1997 Infiniti QX4 from one side of the driveway to the other, and then I went to move it again a few minutes later, and it did nothing. And I'd had no problems up until this point. All of a sudden, it just wouldn't start. And I did notice there didn't seem to be a lot of diagnostic videos as far as like figuring out why your car wouldn't start in relation to this type of problem. So, so obviously the first thing I did was try and start it again, and it did not start. I did notice that the dashboard lights would go out when I tried to start it, but then when I had the headlights on and tried to start, the headlights did not dim. So this is not an immediate indication that it's not a starter problem, but oftentimes when the starter is seized and you try and start the car, the headlights will dim because the starter is binding. I guess maybe a lot of times this happens when the starter is hot. But this time the lights did not dim, and so the possibilities are obviously still, the starter and solenoid. There is a relay called the neutral park relay that's in the engine bay on the left side behind the battery, which, as you can see, is now disconnected. And there's also something called a neutral safety switch, which is located, I believe, in the console of this vehicle. It's not easy to get to. Removing the console is not fun. I've done it once. I don't want to do it again. So what I did was I started at the starter and I worked my way backwards. So with a test light, and I've already removed the starter, so this is a little bit easier to see. But with the test light, this post right here is where the battery cable hooked up. So just to make sure I was getting power from the battery and my test light was working, I tested this first. And my test light looks like a screwdriver, and one lead goes here, and then you ground out the other lead, and the handle lights up when you have power. So the handle lit up here, and I was okay. And so that was good. So then I went to this post, which when the solenoid is active, it sends power to the starter. So I had someone try and start the car with me under it, which, the emergency brake was on, the transmission was in park, and tried to do this as safely as possible. And when it was not trying to be started and nothing was active, the test light did not light up on this post, but it did when it was trying to be started, even though the car did not start. So that told me that the solenoid was working in part, and it was sending power to the starter, and the starter was not engaging. Had this not lit up at all, that could have meant that the solenoid was bad and the starter was okay, but you've got to replace them both now. Older cars you never used to, but also it could have meant that the solenoid was not getting a signal from the ignition. So again, if I had power here, but when it tried to start, I had no power here, I would have pulled this plug off and put my test light up inside that plug on the wiring harness, and had my friend try and start it again. If it had still not lit up, that means the problem was farther back into the car. If it had lit up, that just means my solenoid was bad. So let's just suppose that I tested this lead on the wiring harness and I didn't get any power. From there, I would have gone up to this relay box and I would have gone to the neutral park relay and take the top off, and there is a wiring diagram on the top of the relay. I'll show you here. Positions 1 and 2 are energized by the ignition. That's the coil, and that it closes the circuit between 6 and 7 and 3 and 6. To get this relay out, you put a screwdriver down into the backside, press in gently, and pull firmly out. You would hook 1 and 2, the prongs on the underside, to your battery with like roach clips, pigtails. And then you would check continuity between 6 and 7 and 3 and 6. If you did not have continuity between 6 and 7 and 3 and 6 while the relay was energized, that would mean that your relay is bad. But if your relay tested out good, then you would work your way back to the neutral safety switch, which is inside the console, which I am not going to remove, thankfully, because as it turned out, the starter was indeed bad. And so I went ahead and removed it. To remove the starter, you've got 2 bolts. They're 14 millimeter bolts. And the battery cable is attached by, I believe, a 12 or 13 millimeter nut. I would recommend taking the battery cable loose first, and obviously again we have disconnected the positive cable on the battery. Then remove the 14 millimeter bolts. You're probably not going to be able to get a socket on the bottom one. You will not be able to use a box wrench with a gear head because there's not enough clearance, and just a standard 14 millimeter box wrench will get the bottom one off. And I did use a long extension and a universal adapter for the top bolt. Just made it a little bit easier to get to, and I would definitely recommend that. I'm going to turn on my light, get under the car, and I'll show you where the starter came from. And it is right to the left. There's the oil pan drain plug, and it is just above where the drain pan is, and you can see right there maybe where the positive cable comes down, right in that area. So there's one bolt hole there, and then the other one's on the top. And like I say, I came from back here with a very long extension, get that off. There were no shims on this starter. If there were shims, you definitely need to save them and reuse them. Now, getting the starter out once everything is disconnected, you've got your solenoid control voltage clip there, and then you've got your battery cable there. Those are disconnected. Then you take the bolts off, and then you're going to slide it forward over the front axle and into this area right here under the alternator. And then it comes out of this area straight down and out, and then it'll go back in exactly the same way with the Bendix gear facing you. It'll go in and then slide right back into its hole. This is where the bolt went, where I said you would need the box wrench. It's just impossible to get a socket in there. It's just way too tight. It's right up in that hole. Let me slide out. And this starter came from AutoZone, and oddly enough, probably because this vehicle is not driven very often, it lasted for close to 7 years. But it did have a lifetime warranty, so now I'm going to go get another one. And hopefully this helps somebody out, and good luck on your project.